men and women sort of ought to care for one another, in fact. That actually men and women already do get along, like most of the time or a lot of the time. That there is a genuine love between men and women, whether it's a sexual love or a friendship love or, just a kind of casual, everyday kind of getting along. And, I think there's a kind of media discourse which often plays up the division and hatred, that says like the kill all men hashtag, for example, or I don't know, like these kind of ideas of that the other sex is to blame for everything somehow, like that all of the ills in the world can be put at the feet of one sex or another. And obviously you have misogynist men at one end, and you have kind of, women who want to look for someone to blame and blame men at the other. And like, so, there's a kind of, and there's an imbalance within that as well. We can talk about, historical asymmetries in the way in which like men and women have, treated one another. And certainly, we need to think about the kind of history of women's oppression, but then also think about the, specific forms of like male suffering. And again, these are not in opposition. I think you can have a feminist approach that actually also takes seriously some of the kind of complaints and worries and anxieties that men have, and questions of like male depression are not in opposition to like a feminist analysis at all. So I'm trying to put all these things together, and I suppose to defend particularly the idea that we can play different games with each other, that we can play better games, that this idea of a zero-sum game in which one wins, one loses, is a faulty model, is like a capitalist model, is a model that actually doesn't like work, it doesn't suit us, it doesn't actually relate to how we might love our father or our brother or a friend. We're not in competition with each other.
But you would still describe this as a feminist project.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it absolutely is. And I think there is a tradition of feminists writing about men. Bell Hooks writes about men. There are kind of lots of books which actually take seriously like the question of the imposition of gender roles, for example, how patriarchy hurts men as well as women. I don't think they're incompatible. I think they never used to be seen as incompatible either. I think it's only recently that there's been this kind of increasing division, as if we're supposed to think.
Right, so there's this increasingly vocal, I think you could say, wing of the feminist movement today that sees the kinds of angles that you're describing here as somehow intrinsically anti-feminist. Or, people are quick to hear what you're saying, and they might want to pigeonhole you as some kind of male apologist or even a men's rights activist.
Yeah.
So what do you say to people who want to slot you in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a general thing about this very black and white thinking, as if you, again, it's a zero-sum game, like if you say something positive about men, therefore you must be saying something negative about women, or your focus is not on women, and life is unfortunately much more complicated than a Twitter denunciation, we might say, or a simple kind of yes or no, oh, now she's this, now she's that, I think it's absolutely possible to be a feminist and to think about what that means for men, and to have a feminist analysis of men's issues and men's questions. And I think actually it's not just possible, but it's like important.
Can I ask you I'm just curious, what do you think about the men's rights activism movement?
Well, I think it has to be sort of looked at. I think, where there are forms of real resentment, where there are forms of real complaint, like with everything, like it's better to understand where they're coming from rather than simply write people off. I mean, that would go for any political position, any political claim. And as you know, I think everybody should be listening to everybody. Everybody should be speaking to everybody else. Everybody should be reading things, especially the things that people, gatekeepers and priests, tell you can't read and you can't speak to this person and you mustn't understand this, as if they know somehow that you'll be affected or tainted by reading or speaking to these things. Right, so in that sense, I take some of the MRA complaints at face value in a certain way and say, look, okay, they would suggest that, men die in workplace accidents more than women, men do certain forms of labour that women don't tend to do, that, the kind of suicide rate, the idea that men are sort of demonised for various modes of masculine behaviour, for example, that men don't get custody of their children. I mean, there's like a movement like Fathers for Justice in this country that also makes this argument. And I mean, to not to go along with those necessarily, but to like look at the way in which those things are being posed, like those complaints, you know, and to see how they can be sort of understood, and how like there can be more of a, I don't know, a balance and a response in terms of how we kind of proceed, rather than just like writing men off. You know, we have to say, you know, that there are forms of kind of male behaviour. And male behaviour tends towards the extremes, basically. You know, so where there is extreme behaviour, it will be men at the end of it, you know, whatever kind of behaviour we're talking about. So, you know, where we are looking at these extreme cases of kind of like incel rage, or like men when they kind of act out and kind of, you know, in resentment, in revenge or supposed revenge, you know, kind of end up like murdering people and so on. Like, we have to understand what that kind of like last man standing like video game logic is. Like, what is it that compels that kind of, you know, that solitary, it's me against the world feeling, which I do think is a particular kind of like dominant masculinity today.
I see. So your take is kind of that the liberation of women requires a true and accurate understanding of what's really going on with men. What really are they after? And that would require, on some basic level, a certain amount of empathy, just to be realistic about what's really going on there. Yes,
I agree. And I think also, I mean, for the sake of both men and women, for women, if they don't already know what these discussions about hypergamy and the red pill, and our friend Diana Fleischman is also working on this as well, like the red pill for women, like how, you know, I mean, she's kind of maybe more extreme than me in some ways, but, you know, like what it is to actually, you know, to understand like these kinds of discussions, because I think there are lots of discussions going on, let's say, about game playing, like, so like the idea of the game, the Neil Strauss, which has become like the pickup artist community, and you know, like, so all of those kind of tactics have like evolved in a certain way, and I think lots of women don't know necessarily what kind of tactics some of these men are using, or what they're saying, and of course often it's not very nice, but I think having that kind of knowledge would actually like lead to a kind of greater understanding of the kind of pressures like on both sexes, or felt pressures or assumed pressures, you know. And we have to say, okay, look, so, you know, like patriarchy is bad for women and it's also bad for men, you know, or our current understanding of what patriarchy is in any case. You know, patriarchy in the Bible literally means like these kind of father figures who like look after and take care and have responsibility. And that's very much not what we mean by patriarchy today. And often that kind of word is invoked in a very like amorphous or ambivalent way, you know, like it's just, oh, this is a structure of society. We're not sure if perhaps individual men reproduce patriarchy in their behaviour, like through mansplaining or manspreading, all of these things that we are, you know, angry about that men do, or men are socialised to do. But there is a kind of question about, well, how does the patriarchy reproduce itself actually? Like, how does it like operate on a daily level? You know, is it automatic that men have status and power? And then in a sense, the question becomes, what kind of status and power do they have? And do we want that? I mean, is that the kind of thing that actually people want? Do people want just to get richer, or to like have a position at the head of a company or something like that? Like, actually, aren't there much more fun games and ways of being together that aren't about chasing these kind of status rewards, where the idea of the zero-sum game does come into play?